Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Waturu was the kind of town where people whispered before they spoke and stared longer than they should. Its streets wore the silence of secrets, and its air carried the kind of stillness that made joy feel like a visitor. In this town lived a man named Akina, no taller than a boy in mid-teens, but with a mind like a map of galaxies and a voice that bent pain into poetry. His name opened doors the soles of his feet never reached. When he walked into a room, eyes followed, some in admiration, others with the mocking glee of those who thought height measured a man's worth. Akina had spent the better part of his life climbing over those stairs. As a child, he learned quickly that silence could be armor and books a shield. He fed on knowledge like a starving man at a banquet and grew a following online with his soulful podcasts and magnetic storytelling. People listened not because he shouted, but because he whispered truth in a way that echoed in the hollow parts of their chests. His small frame became a paradox, hated by the shallow, adored by the wise. But like every man who ever conquered a crowd, Akina yearned for a soft place to land. And when he met Ego, he thought he had found it, a flame in a world too cold, a smile that curled like poetry at the edges. Ego came with the scent of expensive body oils and a confidence that brushed against the air like velvet. She was tall, with legs that seemed to walk ahead of her thoughts, and a laugh that made men lean in before they knew why. She ran a boutique on Remy Lane, where mannequins looked better than most brides, and filters never took the day off. When Akina first met her at a Digital Culture Awards gala, she hadn't known who he was. She only smiled when someone mentioned he was that Akina, the voice behind Midnight Windows, the podcast series that had turned pain into soft music for a generation of silent sufferers. Her interest piqued, not out of affection, but ambition. In her world, to be seen beside a name like Akina was to climb a ladder without lifting a finger. Akina, however, read meaning into her soft greetings, her occasional emoji-laced replies, her faux accidental run-ins at cafes. Love, they say, is not blind. It just wears tinted glasses. By the time she agreed to date him, Wataru buzzed with curiosity. The tech star and the beauty queen, brains and body, height and heels. Nobody said it aloud, but the mockery hid in the grins. Akina, too tired of suspicion, drowned his doubts in affection. He saw her past the selfies and the smirks, or at least he thought he did. He told himself that love could teach water to burn and glass to bend. So when he proposed, under soft lanterns and mild applause, it was more than a ring. It was a declaration that he was enough, that someone had chosen him not for his name, but his soul. The wedding trended for 2 weeks on social media and almost made the evening news. Ego wore a dress that could silence a room, and Akina's smile stretched so wide it could have held a sunrise. The crowd clapped, cameras flashed, and hashtags flew like birds let out of cages. But even as they danced their first dance under chandeliers that dripped light like honey, there were cracks behind the curtain. Ego didn't want Akina to carry her. It would look off. She snapped at the tailor for making her heels too short, so she still stood a good 5 inches above her groom. Akina noticed, but chose not to dwell. He told himself love didn't need symmetry. The honeymoon came and went, and the house grew quiet. Ego began to vanish into her phone more often, giggle at messages that didn't include him, and leave lipstick-stained wine glasses on the side table while she complained about how she missed adventure. When she got pregnant, it was Akina who danced alone in the living room, rubbing her belly and speaking to the unborn child with stories and lullabies. Ego mostly scrolled through photo filters, calculating how soon she could fit into her slim-fit gowns again. When their daughter Xena arrived, Akina wept quiet tears that soaked into the sheets as he held his baby like the world might slip if he let go. But even with the joy of fatherhood blooming in his chest, There was a loneliness that sat with him at dinner, lingered in the mirror, and curled beside him in bed, whispering that something wasn't right. In time, the whispers turned into arguments. Ego, once amused by Akina's depth, now rolled her eyes at his metaphors. She called him overrated, said he tried too hard to be wise, that he should just act like a man. One evening, as he set the table for a quiet dinner, she flung her bag on the chair and laughed mid-conversation on the phone. "My friends say I married a bobblehead," she announced casually. "Always nodding and too short to matter." The words sliced through the room like wind through a torn curtain. Akina didn't respond. What was there to say? That he had loved her even when she forgot to return it? That he still wrote poems about the curve of her smile even as she used it to slice his self-worth? That he stayed because he believed in the promise behind her yes? Silence became his retreat. He stopped inviting her into his world and stopped asking to be part of hers. Zena became his solace, the one person who didn't look down at him but up literally and figuratively. He read to her at night, built castles out of cartons, and filled her room with laughter. But even the sound of a child couldn't drown the ache of rejection from the one person he had led into his unguarded places, and so, in the quiet corners of their home, where love once bloomed like hibiscus and harmattan, only echoes remained, memories stuck like cobwebs on ceilings too high for him to reach. He began to realize that being married wasn't the same as being wanted. And wanting someone wasn't enough if they only wanted your spotlight, not your shadow. There's a way a man breaks without making a sound. It's not the crash of plates or the scream of thunder. Sometimes it's the quiet way he folds a shirt that no longer smells like her perfume, or the way he hums to himself in the kitchen just to feel like his voice still matters. That was the season Akina entered, a silent storm. Ego had become more of a resident ghost than a wife. Her footsteps were predictable, like the ticking of a worn-out clock. She'd come in, toss her designer bags by the door, eat half a fruit, scroll through her phone, and vanish into the guest room under the guise of needing space. There were no more "I missed yous" or "How was your days?" Even Zena, sharp-eyed and sensitive, had started asking why Mummy doesn't laugh here. But Ego wasn't one to be pinned down by guilt. She walked through the house as if the walls owed her comfort, and every little thing became a trigger. If Akina forgot to warm the soup, she'd sigh like she married a burden. If he posted a photo of Zena without asking her first, she'd accuse him of using their daughter for clout. At first, he tried. God knows he tried. He wrote notes and slid them into her purse, soft words, short verses, reminders of love. He even booked a weekend retreat just for the two of them. She canceled it last minute, citing a friend's bridal shower. That night, he stared at the untouched reservation email until the screen dimmed on its own, just like his spirit. And yet, he kept wearing hope like a threadbare jacket, useless against the cold, but too familiar to throw away. The straw that broke what was already brittle didn't come with a bang. It came with indifference. One Sunday morning, as sun rays filtered into the sitting room and gospel hymns hummed softly from the stereo, Akina reached for Ego's hand across the breakfast table. It was a simple gesture, a silent olive branch. But she jerked her hand back, rolled her eyes, and muttered, "We're not in a movie, Akina. Stop acting like we're something we're not." The knife didn't have to cut deep. It was the frequency of cuts that left him bleeding. Later that evening, as they passed each other in the hallway like strangers in a hotel, she dropped it, her voice calm, casual, like she was canceling a subscription. "I want a divorce," she said, without even slowing her steps. Akina didn't chase after her. He didn't scream. He stood there, rooted, like a tree that just heard the axe whisper its name. That night, he sat by Zena's bedside longer than usual. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, asking if he would take her to school the next day. He watched her breathe, small chest rising and falling like gentle tides. In her innocence, she had no idea that her world was about to split like dry earth under sunstroke. The next morning, Ego packed 2 suitcases and left a typed letter on the dining table. Not handwritten, typed, as if even her goodbye needed to be sterile. Ikenna stared at the document, eyes scanning words he couldn't remember reading. All he saw was the space between the sentences, the emptiness of someone who once promised forever but now couldn't even spare her own signature. When news of the divorce reached the ears of Wataru, it didn't come quietly. Social media spun it into a circus. Anonymous blogs hinted at infidelity. Fans speculated Ego had been the victim, painting Ikenna as a controlling husband too insecure to handle a beautiful woman. Others defended him, citing his years of consistency, his kindness, his humility. But Ikenna didn't say a word. He logged off every platform, deleted every app, and buried his name beneath silence. His podcast stopped. The weekly posts that once inspired thousands evaporated. Sponsorships pulled out. Brands moved on. Fame, once a roaring fire, became dying embers. He spent his days indoors, wearing the same gray hoodie and jeans like a uniform of grief. The fridge echoed with emptiness. The curtains stayed drawn. Friends called, texted, left voicemails that sounded more like prayers than messages, but he didn't respond. Some nights he sat on the floor, back against the wall, clutching a bottle of gin like it owed him answers. He wasn't an alcoholic, just a man trying to quiet the noise in his head. Sometimes the silence got too loud. He'd replay old voice notes from Xena, her laughter like bubbles in a graveyard. Her absence carved holes in him, especially on weekends when the court allowed her visits, but Ego always had an excuse. And when the neighbors asked why the lights stayed off for days, they didn't get answers. Just the same drawn curtains and the outline of a man fading in his own home. Pain, when left to fester, starts to rewrite a man's narrative. Ikenna began to question everything. Was he ever truly loved, or had he just been a stepping stone in someone's climb? He remembered moments, Ego's half smiles, the way she always posted photos cropped just above his head, the awkward introductions to her friends who never hid their smirks. He realized he had mistaken tolerance for affection. His love had been a tree planted in shallow soil, and now the roots were exposed, dry, cracking beneath the weight of disappointment. The man who once spoke with metaphors now struggled to finish a sentence. Even the books he used to devour sat untouched, their covers mocking him like unopened letters. But grief has strange stages, and even in its deepest valley, a flicker can spark. One afternoon, weeks into his isolation, he picked up a pen, just to scribble. What began as doodles turned into verses. Not for the world, not for content, just for himself. His words stumbled at first, like legs relearning balance, but slowly the lines grew stronger. One poem bled into another. He started keeping a journal again, its pages raw with anger, ache, and unspoken prayers. He wrote about the night air that no longer felt cold, because numbness had become his sweater. He wrote about Xena's giggles trapped in voicemail folders. And somewhere in those pages, a seed stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something quieter. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, broken men could breathe again, that even the ashes of a dream could carry the scent of rain if the wind changed its mind. Grief, when it overstays its welcome, stops asking for permission. It moves into the living room, sleeps on the couch, and drinks from your favorite mug. It was during one of these long afternoons in March, when the sun couldn't decide whether to shine or sulk, that Ikenna wandered into a small, hidden bookstore on the edge of Abera Street. The place had no signboard, just a narrow door wedged between a cobbler's stall and a fabric shop. It smelled like forgotten pages and old music. He hadn't planned to walk in. In fact, he hadn't planned anything in weeks. But something about the worn-out glass on the door, the creak of the wooden frame, the rustle of pages from inside, it drew him in like a whisper from an old friend. And that's where he saw her. Stephanie. She wasn't striking in the conventional sense, but she had that kind of beauty that didn't try, like a breeze that shows up just when the room starts to choke. Her afro framed her face like a question that begged to be answered, and her laughter, rich, unforced, danced through the bookstore like perfume you couldn't bottle. She was crouched in the corner aisle, flipping through a worn-out copy of James Baldwin. Akina didn't speak right away. He browsed lazily, running his fingers over spines he had no interest in, but his eyes kept drifting to her. When their eyes finally met, it wasn't dramatic. No fireworks. No music cue. Just a simple nod. Recognition. Not of fame, not of titles, but of souls that had seen the same kind of night. Stephanie didn't bring up his fame. She didn't ask why he hadn't posted in months, or why his face looked heavier than his frame. Instead, she made a joke about how Baldwin would have been terrible on Twitter, and that broke the ice. They talked softly, like two people who understood that loud things often break. She had once been a music teacher, but now ran a community arts center in East Waterloo. Not for clout, she added quickly, but because kids need somewhere to scream safely. That line stuck with him. They didn't exchange numbers that day. Just names and a shared silence that felt warmer than most conversations. Over the next few weeks, their paths kept crossing, accidentally at first, then with intent. A coffee here, a late walk there. She had a way of making the ordinary feel cinematic. Akina found himself smiling more, though it wasn't the broad grin he wore for cameras. It was quieter, tucked in the corners of his mouth, like an old hymn remembered at the sound of rain. He didn't rush into anything. The wreckage from ego still clung to him like dust on an unused frame. But Stephanie didn't try to sweep it away. She let him speak in fragments. She didn't offer healing, only presence. And that, to Akina, felt like a lifeline thrown without demand for thanks. One evening, as they sat outside a modest tea house, watching yellow lights shimmer in puddles after the rain, Stephanie turned to him and said, "You've been breathing, but not living." Akina didn't answer immediately. He watched her fingers trace patterns on her cup, her nails bare, her wrists soft with the scent of sandalwood. "I'm afraid of being seen again," he confessed. "Not by the crowd, but by someone who won't run when the lights are off." Stephanie didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small notebook, and handed it to him. "Write," she said, "even if it's nonsense. Just write like your life depends on it, because it does." That night, Akina sat at his desk for the first time in months. The same desk where he'd once poured out words that healed strangers. He picked up his pen and scribbled, not for an audience, not for applause, but for himself. The words stumbled, but they came. They were shaky, awkward, unsure, but they were his. And the more he wrote, the less space the silence had to stretch its legs. Days became a little more structured. He started waking up earlier, walking short distances, sometimes just to catch the smell of bread from the corner shop or the sound of schoolchildren arguing about cartoons. Stephanie kept showing up not to fix him, but to walk beside him as he fixed himself. And somewhere between those unplanned visits and intentional silences, he began to feel the old spark flicker again. Months passed like chapters in a book he was finally ready to read again. Akina and Stephanie grew into each other, not in a whirlwind, but in a slow, deliberate unfolding, like dawn stretching into morning. When he asked her to be with him officially, he didn't plan a grand gesture. No flowers, no soft jazz. Just a question whispered while she watered her plants on a sleepy Saturday, "Would you like to grow with me?" She laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was real. And she said yes. Their relationship bloomed in the shade, not out loud, not for public eyes. Akina reactivated his social accounts, but didn't post photos of them right away. He returned with stories, short thoughts, gentle reflections. His followers rejoiced. Brands came back knocking, but he was different now. He said no more than yes. He posted when he had something to say, not just something to sell. One morning, he recorded a podcast after a year-long silence. He called it, What the Mirror Couldn't Show. His voice cracked halfway through, but he didn't edit it out. He spoke of vulnerability, of starting again, of forgiveness that has no audience. He didn't name ego. He didn't need to. The power was in the restraint. Stephanie sat in the next room, listening with tears in her eyes, not because he sounded broken, but because he sounded free. And in that quiet, honest return, Ikenna didn't just find his voice. He found his soul, untamed, unfiltered, and finally, no longer waiting for permission to breathe. Love, when it is quiet and honest, doesn't wear makeup or dance for the crowd. It grows in the soil of ordinary days, watered by patience, shielded from the noise. That's how it unfolded between Ikenna and Stephanie. There were no fireworks, no declarations lit up in the sky, just two people learning how to sit with their scars and not flinch. Stephanie moved into Ikenna's apartment not out of desperation or convenience, but because their silences had begun to fit. She brought with her the smell of clove soap, jazz records, and two potted plants that she treated like children. The place transformed, not into a mansion or a picture-perfect catalog home, but into something more sacred. Laughter returned, not in explosions, but in soft, unexpected waves. She'd tease him about how he oversteeped his tea. He'd argue about her obsession with incense sticks. They made a home, not a performance. Some nights they sat on the floor and read poetry to each other, trading verses like secrets. On rainy evenings, they cooked together, badly at first. Stephanie once burned the stew, and Ikenna exaggerated his coughing so much they both ended up laughing until their ribs ached. Slowly, the shadows of the past loosened their grip. Stephanie never asked for the spotlight, never tried to edit his past or chase his fame. And in return, Ikenna found himself leaning more into the present, realizing that healing wasn't about forgetting what broke you. It was about remembering how you survived. Zena visited often now. Ego, perhaps out of convenience or indifference, no longer withheld their daughter. The little girl had grown taller, her smile still wide, her questions more layered. At first, she stared at Stephanie the way a child inspects a new toy, curious but cautious. But Stephanie met her with open arms, not as a replacement, not as a competitor, but as a warm space. It started with bedtime stories, then baking lessons, then sitting beside each other during movie nights, sharing a bowl of popcorn too big for either of them to finish. Zena asked once, "Is she your new wife?" Ikenna had knelt beside her, held her tiny hand, and said, "She's someone who makes my heart peaceful." Zena nodded, satisfied, and went back to her coloring. Children know what peace feels like, even when they can't name it. One Saturday afternoon, while drawing under the corridor light, Zena scribbled the words, "Our family," over a stick figure sketch that had 3 people and 2 potted plants. Ikenna took a photo of it and tucked it into his journal. The home no longer echoed with loneliness. It breathed, it stretched, it hummed with newness. Stephanie brought softness without asking for credit. She blended into their rhythm like someone who had been part of the melody all along. She never posted photos, never made things performative. Her presence was like a hand on the back during a storm, not holding, not pulling, just reminding you you're not alone. The wedding came unexpectedly. Ikenna hadn't planned a second one, not after the way the first felt like a public screening of a private egg. But one evening, while walking near the coast of East Waduru, where the breeze carried stories and silence shared secrets, he turned to Stephanie and asked, "Would you mind being my home forever?" She didn't blink. "I already am," she said, her voice laced with truth and no theater. They got married under a mango tree in the backyard of an old friend's cottage. Just 20 people. No loudspeakers. Fairs, speakers, beacons, Wexorona tartegas. No nouns, Western interest, Woodwoods, Foutier, for no speakers. Poor no, non-speakers, nowadays widows, and no theaters. No clout-chasing cousins. Xena wore a sunflower dress and held the rings. Ikenna wore a soft cream agbada with no embroidery, just plain and peaceful, like his heart. Stephanie looked like sunlight bottled in brown skin. Her hair was tied up with a scarf the color of the morning sky, and she wore no makeup but joy. As they exchanged vows, the birds above didn't pause, the wind didn't hush. Nature didn't make a spectacle of them, and that made it all the more sacred. Afterward, they shared bowls of pepper soup and cups of zobo with the guests, seated on wooden chairs under string lights. No cameras, no hashtags, just warmth, just truth. Ikenna didn't post anything that day. Not because he was hiding, but because the moment didn't need validation. It already existed in full color within him. The kind of day he would carry not on the cloud, but in the chambers of his soul. A year passed like breath on a window, seen in moments, gone in rhythm. Stephanie got pregnant, and the news made Ikenna weep. He wasn't expecting it. They hadn't planned rigorously. But when she showed him the test in the kitchen one breezy afternoon, he dropped the dish towel and hugged her like the world had given him back something he thought was lost. The pregnancy was smooth, peppered with cravings and baby kicks, with Xena placing her ear on Stephanie's stomach to say goodnight. They played guessing games about the baby's name, argued over names that sounded like uncles from the village, and finally agreed on Jude. Ikenna wrote every kick, every scan, every strange craving in a small leather-bound notebook titled For When You Ask. When Jude arrived, strong lungs, full hair, fists curled like promises, Ikenna held him against his chest and whispered, "You came when I stopped begging and started becoming." Stephanie watched them from the bed, tears tracing soft lines down her cheeks. There was no longer any bitterness left to hold. No room for resentment. Their home became a breathing, growing sanctuary, books stacked in corners, laughter woven into the curtains, and joy hanging on the walls like framed memories. Ikenna returned online with a new light in his voice. Not a comeback, because he was never performing again. Just a continuation. The man once mocked for his size now stood tall, not on a stage, not on a podium, but in the arms of those who truly saw him. And that, finally, was enough. Fame returned to Ikenna like an old friend who had once overstayed his welcome but now came knocking with a gentler knock. Only this time, it didn't come bearing applause or floodlights. It returned dressed in stillness, welcomed by a man who no longer needed it to feel whole. His online presence had shifted. The wise words still flowed, but they were wrapped in new textures, stories of fatherhood, snapshots of quiet mornings with Jude asleep on his chest, reflections on growth that didn't beg for engagement. His podcast, once dormant, now pulsed with a new rhythm. Stephanie co-hosted some episodes, her voice a soft counterpoint to his more layered tone. They called it hard work, and it wasn't about trending topics or controversy. It was about what life looked like after the applause, and listeners came back in droves. Not because he was famous, but because he was finally whole. People didn't just want to hear his voice, they wanted to sit beside his peace. He'd get messages from strangers saying, "I feel like I'm listening to someone who made it out of a fire with the smell of smoke still on his coat." And that was true. Ikenna didn't sanitize his past, he just stopped bleeding for applause. Even the corporate world returned, sponsorships, speaking gigs, panel invites, but this time he was selective. He no longer walked into rooms needing validation. He walked in offering value. The boy who once felt too small to be seen had become a man who no longer needed to shout to be heard. But not every voice from the past remained silent. One afternoon, while packing Xena's school bag, Ikenna's phone buzzed with a name he hadn't seen in years, Ego. The screen lit up with her name like a ghost tapping the window. He stared at it until it stopped ringing. She texted later that evening, "I saw the podcast. I'm happy for you. I hope Xena's still okay with me picking her next week." The words weren't cruel. They weren't warm either. Just factual. But it stirred something. Not longing, God, no. but reflection. Stephanie saw the message and didn't flinch. People who left don't always want back in, she said, rinsing plates. Sometimes they just want to know if you survived the damage. That night, Ikenna wrote a new journal entry. Not a poem, not a rant. Just clarity. He realized that ego had been a mirror he once stared into, hoping to see value. But mirrors can only reflect what's already there, and he had spent years begging for a reflection that loved him back. Now, with Stephanie and the children, he no longer needed mirrors. He had windows. People who let light in, who let him see further than his past. He replied to Ego's message with a simple, "Zena's fine. Thank you." No punctuation, no need for performance. Closure doesn't always knock with drama. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wipes its feet, and sits down like it never left. Zena was 9 now, a bundle of questions and laughter, with eyes that sparkled with mischief and wisdom far beyond her age. She adored Jude, even if she sometimes complained about his constant need for attention. Their bond was the kind only distance could have written, a bond rooted in missed moments and made sweeter by presence. Stephanie had long earned Zena's trust, not by bribing or overstepping, but by simply showing up every day. She became not a stepmother, but a second light, different from the one that birthed her, but no less warm. On weekends, they'd go for walks around the old garden near Alico Creek. Jude would ride on Ikenna's back, Zena would collect weird-shaped stones, and Stephanie would hum old folk songs that made strangers stop and smile. It wasn't a perfect life. Some nights, the baby wouldn't sleep. Bills still came with their sharp edges, and sometimes the ghosts of doubt still tapped at the window. But it was a full life, not loud, not flashy, just real. Ikenna began to understand something he had never grasped in his younger years. Happiness isn't something you chase, it's something you grow, like a plant that takes root when you water it with kindness and time. He wasn't famous because he had millions of followers again. He was famous in his home. Zena adored him. Jude reached for him, and Stephanie loved him in a way that didn't shout but echoed long after she left the room. One Sunday, during the golden spill of evening, Ikenna stood on their small veranda, watching the sky perform its daily vanishing act. Jude was asleep, cheek pressed against Stephanie's shoulder, while Zena drew faces on a fogged window. The breeze carried the smell of beans and fried plantains from a neighbor's kitchen. Stephanie leaned on the wooden rail beside him, and for a while they didn't speak. Silence between them was no longer awkward. It was comfortable, earned, sacred. Then, as if reading his mind, she said, "If the old you saw you now, would he believe it?" Ikenna chuckled softly, his hand brushing hers. "The old me thought healing looked like applause. But this," he paused, gesturing toward the room filled with sleepy breaths and laughter, "this is louder than a million claps." They stayed like that until the stars took their positions, steady and unashamed. Later that night, Ikenna knelt by his bed, not out of obligation, not to bargain with heaven, but in gratitude. He prayed not for more, but for sustenance, for peace to remain, for love to never sour, for the strength to remain present even when storms tried to return. As he whispered, he knew that tomorrow might come with noise, with deadlines, with the unpredictable chaos of life, but inside him a garden had bloomed. And this time, no one would be allowed to trample it, not the past, not rejection, not even the shadow of what once broke him. There's a sacred quiet that comes after long sorrow, the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself with trumpets, but settles like dew on a leaf at dawn. Ikenna had not only survived the storm that once bent his spine with grief, he had now grown into the kind of man who didn't just exist in the light, but carried it within him. His life no longer moved to the tempo of applause or disapproval. He had found his own rhythm, one shaped not by the world's opinions, but by the pulse of grace and the steadiness of his second chance. Jude was now, too, walking with that curious wobble toddlers are known for, his laughter bouncing off the walls like music that never tired. Zena had taken to teaching him words, and sometimes she'd pretend to be his teacher, correcting him with exaggerated seriousness that made Stephanie laugh so hard she'd have to sit on the floor. Ikena's home had become a sanctuary, not because it was spotless or spacious, but because it had been built with truth. There were days the sink overflowed, days when the fridge echoed with the emptiness of forgotten grocery lists, and days when tempers flared for reasons too small to remember. But even in the chaos, there was love, and that made all the difference. He no longer looked at life as something to conquer. He looked at it like a long conversation, some parts awkward, others unforgettable, but all of it necessary. One morning, he received an email inviting him to speak at a prestigious media conference in Lakeshore. The theme was the journey back to joy. Years ago, he would have jumped at the opportunity, seen it as validation, as proof that he still mattered. But now, he pondered it differently. He discussed it with Stephanie over their usual cinnamon tea, and she gave him the kind of nod that didn't push but encouraged. He accepted. And so, 2 weeks later, Ikena stood on a wide stage beneath cool lights and a banner that carried his name in bold, glossy letters. The hall was filled with professionals, students, artists, entrepreneurs, people hungry not just for success, but for meaning. When he began to speak, he didn't list achievements or drop punchy quotes. He told a story, his own, from the beginning. He spoke of the applause that once filled the void, of the marriage that mirrored loneliness, of the silence that nearly swallowed him whole. He described the moment he stopped trying to be enough for others and began learning how to be enough for himself. The room grew so quiet you could hear pens pausing mid-word. And then, when he spoke of Stephanie, of Zena's stick drawings, of Jude's soft breath against his chest, his voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd reclaimed. Joy isn't loud, he said in closing. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone calling your name without agenda. Sometimes it's coming home to a house that doesn't ask you to perform. The speech went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was raw. People found their own reflections in his words. Broken men, silenced women, wounded creatives, single parents, and quiet warriors who had learned to live without applause. But Ikena didn't let the attention sweep him off balance this time. He returned home, kicked off his shoes, and helped Stephanie fold laundry. The fame no longer clung to him like it once did. It didn't dictate his worth. It didn't own his joy. It was just a ripple in the river, not the current. And life, as it always does, continued with its mix of ordinary and magic. Zena won a poetry contest at school, reciting a piece she'd written titled The Short Tree That Grew Tall. Ikena wept quietly in the audience, holding Jude in his lap. The title was hers, but the metaphor was his. Stephanie started offering music lessons to women who'd left abusive relationships, using melodies to remind them they were still whole. Ikena supported her initiative, not with press coverage, but with his presence, watching the kids, making dinner, reminding her that her dream was just as worthy of breath. And when storms came, as they always do, they weathered them side by side. Not perfectly, but patiently. Because love, at its purest, isn't about the absence of pain. It's about the presence of someone who stays even when it rains. One quiet evening, Ikena sat by the veranda, Jude asleep beside him, Zena inside sketching clouds with crayons, and Stephanie humming from the kitchen. The sky above had spilled into a soft pink bruise, the kind that makes you forget to speak. He opened his journal, its pages now filled with entries of both ache and awe, and wrote a line he'd been carrying in his chest for months. I am no longer waiting to be tall in the eyes of the world. I am tall in the hearts that love me. As the words settled, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled, not a smile for show, but the kind that starts in the soul and reaches the skin like the first sun after harmattan. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man recovering from something. He felt like a man living for something, and that, more than anything, was the victory no award could ever wrap in gold. As the stars began to prick the sky like lanterns hung by angels, Ikena whispered a prayer, not for riches, not for applause, but for continuation. For laughter to never feel foreign, for peace to keep choosing his doorstep, and for his story to keep being told in small, soft ways. And with that, he rose, scooped Jude into his arms, and walked back into the house, not into a spotlight, but into the kind of love that doesn't need one. Dear listener, if you followed Ikena's story to the end, then you already know that sometimes life doesn't break you in one big crash. It breaks you little by little, through the quiet sting of rejection, the weight of unspoken pain, and the silence of people who should have clapped for you but didn't. But here's what Ikena teaches us. Just because someone couldn't see your worth doesn't mean you were worthless. Love is not supposed to feel like begging, and peace is not a luxury. It is your right. Don't let someone's shallow gaze convince you to shrink. Don't pour all your fire into someone who only wants your light but not your warmth. You are not too small for love, too broken for healing, or too late for joy. Sometimes the people who walked away were the door that needed to close so that something softer, something deeper, could walk in. And when healing comes, it may not be loud, but it will be sure. Take your time. Grow slowly. Speak your truth, even if your voice trembles. You don't need a crowd to matter. You just need people who see you fully and choose you without conditions. And if you're still in your valley, still surrounded by echoes and shadows, hold on, because light will come. Maybe not as a spotlight. Maybe just as the warmth of someone who says, I see you, and I'm not leaving. For everyone listening right now, those with hearts that have been bruised by rejection, those carrying the weight of being overlooked, misunderstood, or belittled, wrap them in a peace that passes understanding. Heal the hidden wounds that no one claps for. Speak life into every silent ache. Turn every private sorrow into a public testimony of joy. For the one who gave their best and still wasn't enough for the wrong person, remind them that their value is not up for negotiation. Restore what was broken not just with replacements, but with beauty that feels like home. Send into their lives the kind of love that doesn't need performance, the kind that sees scars and still stays. Plant in them the courage to begin again, to speak again, to love again, and to rise without bitterness, without fear. Let them walk in rooms not to prove themselves, but to bless it with their presence. May they never forget that being chosen by the right soul is worth more than being applauded by the wrong crowd. So we declare Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.